Good afternoon. I want to welcome those of you who are joining now. We're going to wait a few minutes. We have about over 40 people registered for this event and want to make sure we give people time to join in before we get started. Looks like we've got quite a few people have joined in so far. So thank you for that. Again, we'll give another minute or two to see if we can get up to our 40 participants who are planning on joining. All right, well, I think we'll get started. Looks like most of you are attending now and have joined us. A few more might be jumping in here as we get going, but wanted to start on time. I appreciate all of you who are taking time out for this webinar. We're going to cover today some exit strategies and talk about the exit process. And this is a panel discussion, and at the end we'll have time for questions and answers. So as we go through this, at any time, you can submit in the chat. You can submit a question, and we'll start capturing those. And then as we go through the presentation, you can do that anytime. And then at the end, we'll go over them. So we'll start off here with a little bit of information about NuVescor. So NuVescor is hosting this webinar. We are a mergers and acquisitions firm, and we focus in the manufacturing space. And we have a niche focus within metal fabrication. So we've been in business for over 20 years, and we really put a lot of effort into educating the market in terms of how to prepare for sale. Our goal is to try and help overcome some of the things that we've seen in the industry. One of the stats are that 75% of companies actually they go into a transaction that the transaction fails before it closes. And so we're trying to help educate and help business owners prepare better to avoid that. But the bigger issue is that even after they're completed, there's a lot of owners who regret actually selling their company, and that's obviously something you can't undo. So we want to make sure we cover as much as we can to help overcome those issues. And today we're joined by Eric Fogg, and he's going to be talking a little bit from the sales side, but he's also been involved in acquisitions as well. Years ago, well, probably 16 years ago now, I helped Eric sell his company. This was back when I didn't own NuVescor. This is when I was just an employee there. So since then, when a lot of changes have happened to the company, Eric's seen those changes. We've remained friends and colleagues and have worked together on other projects over the years. And also Raji Singh is joining us. Raji and I have looked at other projects together, acquisitions. He has actually acquired companies in the metal fabrication space, and he's also sold his own company that he built. So he's got a lot of experience in M&A that he can share. And myself, Randy Rua, I'm the president of NuVescor, and I will look forward to going over the material today with you. So I'll start off with a little bit of background on myself, and then I'll give Eric and Raji a chance to talk about their background. So I started out in engineering a long time ago, back about 25 years ago, I guess, in college now. Went to work at a manufacturing business in the automotive space, and then I left to get my MBA. My father has always been in business. When I was a kid, I helped him in his company. He worked in helping set up facilities all over the world for manufacturing companies at a consulting firm. And he sold that business. And at first, when he sold it, I was kind of disappointed because I thought maybe I would take it over someday. But it actually worked out better that after I got my MBA, we actually worked together to buy a couple companies. And that was a great experience buying companies. We merged two of them together. We sold all of them. And I really enjoyed the buying and the selling process. So that was over 20 years ago now. And so I got into full-time doing M&A work and worked for the firm that helped us sell our company. And ever since then, I've been in M&A. Ended up buying NuVescor, starting another firm in the M&A space, and really have put my efforts and energy into helping improve the statistics that I talked about, the failure rates of transactions not coming to completion, and also the regret that I mentioned, trying to make sure that owners have a good experience and that when they complete the process, they can look back a year later and say, yes, that's something I would do again. That's kind of what I tell my team is our measure of success is, if you call a year from now, is that client going to say, yes, I'm glad I did that transaction? Or are they going to say, that was the worst thing I ever did. I wish I wouldn't have done that. And so that's been our mission. And Eric, why don't you share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Other than what you can see on the screen and read for yourself, I started in business when I was 9. My father started a machine shop, and I was the only employee. I'm the oldest of 5 boys, and all of us were eventually hired to do parts. At 14, I bought a second company, a very small one, that made pen sets for banks. After college, traveling the world a bit, I bought a company called Holland Custom Metalworks. It was a small firm at the time, extremely tiny, only 3 people. And it was nearly bankrupt. Grew the company over the course of the next 12 years, and then sold in 2008 in the midst of a horrible economic times. Then took our family and did a year's worth of language school in Costa Rica in Spanish, and moved to Ecuador, where we worked for the next 6.5 years on the edge of the jungle doing clean water projects for a Christian mission agency. And then moving back to Michigan, where I live now, where I take and work now with Christian business owners and leaders, helping them to grow their business and live out their faith at work. It's a wonderful career path that God has designed.
Thanks, Eric. Raji, would you be willing to share a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thanks, Randy. Raji Singh here with Broadgate Capital. As Randy mentioned earlier, I started my own company directly out of college in 1993. I'll date myself here. Grew that to a pretty viable company and sold that in 2005. So I've gone through kind of the process that every business owner eventually wants to go through at some point. In 2005, started dabbling in real estate investing and got very bored with that. And by 2011, wanted to kind of double down and get back into manufacturing. So I took a different route, and instead of buying my own company, I made investments in companies. And so since 2011, we've made investments in over 10 companies and primarily the manufacturing space. So really have a background now in precision metal manufacturing, which is kind of a very interesting sector for us. And so we look forward to doing more transactions in that sector going forward.
Thanks, Raji. So to give you an idea, we're going to talk about today. We're going to start off with looking at the current state of the industry from M&A perspective, also just from an operations perspective. Then discuss the aspects of preparing a business for sale, going through the actual exit process and discussing what that looks like, and also discussing the role of an M&A advisor and kind of how working with the right team of advisors can help ensure a successful transaction. And then we'll end with the question and answers. So please continue to submit questions throughout the webinar so that at the end we can go through those for you. So to start off here with the current state of the metal fabrication industry, one of the things I wanted to touch on is what we've seen so far in over the years in this space. And so in the beginning, I would say 20 years ago, when I first started selling companies in the metal fabrication space, a lot of them were small shops. They had really skilled craftsmen, and things I've seen change over the years is more use of equipment, especially automation equipment. So automated laser cutters and material handling equipment for handling sheet metal, automated bending equipment and welding equipment, and just really not necessarily taking the place of the craftsman, I guess, but making it less reliant on that skill set, which has helped these companies grow. But to be able to afford the automation, you have to be a certain size. So we're starting to see larger shops buy smaller shops and continue to increase their scale and scope and be able to reinvest into the equipment, and they can afford to do that because of the volume that they're doing versus the small shops that maybe can't afford to invest in that type of equipment. So that's one thing we're seeing. Another thing I wanted to point out is that the industry is very fragmented. So I saw an article in January from Industry Select, and they said there's 34,000 metal fabrication companies out there, and that still baffles me. I thought it was more like 15 to 16,000, but they define the industry kind of broad. But if you're doing any kind of precision metal work, they kind of call that metal fabrication. So that's why it's that broad. But still, 34,000. That's a lot of companies in the United States. And the Exit Planning Institute did a survey of businesses, and they found out that right now about 75% of business owners plan to exit in the next 10 years. So if you take the metal fabrication industry and you use those stats, 75% of the 34,000 companies out there are going to plan to transition and sell or exit, do some type of transition. That's a lot of companies that have to transition. So if you're thinking about, okay, where do you fit into that, time-wise, and what's happening in the industry, the fact that it is fragmented, the fact that it is an opportunity to consolidate into larger companies that can invest in automation. It's really a good time to be a potential seller in the beginning stage of this process. I think as you get towards the end, once there's been a lot of consolidation that's occurred, and it might be not as attractive to sell in that space when there's a lot of companies, but there's already been that kind of scale up. So that's something that I'm seeing. But Raji, I'd love to hear a little bit about what you're seeing from a buyer's perspective, because you're out there looking at opportunities. That's how you and I met originally, is looking at opportunities in the metal fabrication space. But would love to hear what you're seeing, and kind of not only in things you're looking at, but also that you own companies in this space, what you're seeing with those companies.
Yeah, I would add to everything you said. I would say that the market's it's still very active, but it's a lot more selective. I think that especially from a buying perspective, we're looking for companies that have been educated on the sale process, so that they're not just kind of kicking tires to see what's out there. So I think being prepared to go to market is very, very important. And we're seeing kind of maybe two types of buyers that are out there, not only from the buying perspective, but also from selling portfolio companies. We are seeing kind of larger strategics that are looking to acquire smaller companies, whether it's for capability, whether it's for geographic locations, whether it's for a customer base. And we're also seeing kind of the financial buyer that would be a private equity group that has an investment into the metal fab space and wants to expand their portfolio. And from a seller's perspective, we're seeing a lot of family businesses where the next generation has gone off and is not wanting to stay involved with the family business. And so you're having to force yourself to think about the exit a lot more seriously when you don't have a legacy plan. So that's some of the perspectives we're seeing out there.
Great. Thanks, Raji. And in talking about preparing for sale, we talking about preparation. That's a word that can mean a lot of different things. There's a lot of different aspects to it. One of the things that a part of being prepared is just really to understand the process itself of what you have to go through to sell. As Raji mentioned, there's people that kind of dabble in it. They'll talk to buyers. They'll entertain talking to buyers, but they're really not anywhere near prepared to actually go through a process. But there's also an aspect of understanding what you want to accomplish in the sale. And I think that's why a lot of the transactions fail, is they kind of get into discussions with buyers and they're kind of not really ready to do the process, and they haven't really thought through what do they want to accomplish, what type of buyer are they looking for, what do they hope to see happen after the transaction, what do they hope to get out of it value-wise. I mean, there's a lot of questions that haven't been answered yet, which causes problems. But Eric, I'd like to get a little bit of your input from your experience, have gone through the process yourself of selling, and also in your family going through that process and selling the family business. Just as you think about preparing and thinking about the type of buyer that might be a good fit, just wanted to get your input on that.
Sure, I can go a couple of ways. The one that comes to mind at this level of talking about being prepared is that most owners don't think about designing the sale. They don't sit down and think about, what am I going to do when it's sold? What kind of buyer do I want to sell to? Do I want to go and sell it to the employees, to a competitor, to upstream or downstream in the supply chain? They've spent a lifetime trying to take and develop a business, but then they haven't really thought about the process of designing the sale. I think in the actual process of getting numbers or some due diligence stuff there's a lot of people that can help with that, but the hard work of the emotional, mental work to take and be prepared mentally in advance, sometimes a year, a decade, sometimes, if your family is involved or multifamily people are working in, how is that going to be managed? And how does that fit with your mission and your culture values of your company, of how you're going to sell it? I've seen an entire bunch of owners create a mission statement that's extremely employee focused. But when it comes to the time of the sale, they throw all that out the window and they violate their own company principles in the process of selling. And that makes an extreme culture shock, if not chaos, when bought by another company.
Yes, yeah, and one of the things that I see too is that the finding the right buyer fit is so key. You can waste a lot of time talking to buyers that maybe you're thinking you want to get the best price, but really, if you don't get the right fit, even if you get a better price, it's not going to be a transaction that you're happy with at the end of the day. So thinking through, as Eric said, who you want to sell to, what type of transaction you're looking for, really helps streamline the process, because then make sure you're talking to the right people. And as we talk about it from the buy side, I guess, Raji, I'd like to hear your input on that, because I know that's something that you like to do, is make sure there's alignment between what you as a buyer kind of do with companies versus maybe different buyers. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how how you see buyers or sellers being prepared to make sure that they're looking for the right fit.
Yeah, I think again, I think you're starting well in advance of the day that you want to sell. You can't start 6 months in advance. It's years, like we said here, it could be decades. But at the end of the day, being well prepared for it, both with your numbers, with the way your factory looks, and also mentally. But at the end of the day, what we look for, if we were going to look for a company in a different geographic area, we want to make sure we're finding something that's unique. What do they do different? Who their customer base is. And over the years, I've realized that the management team in place is super important. It's not only the seller. We love when a seller can be involved, but if he doesn't have a team, then we're just investing in that seller, and that's tough. There's other things, criteria that comes into play when we're looking at companies. I'm a big fan of a well-organized production floor. I'm also a big fan of making sure that a company that's going to market, they can't go in with outdated machinery. They don't have to have the most cutting edge, but they really just can't go and expect that they're going to sell their business with 25, 30-year-old equipment. So at the end of the day, some of that investment has to be made prior to going to market. So those are some of the criteria we look at. And, it is important from a financial perspective to make sure that you have your financials and your accounting records in place and well organized before you go to market.
Thanks,
Randy,
Rod.
if you don't mind, I'd like to step back into the bounce back into the seller side with that in mind.
Sure.
As we're designing the sale, being prepared for the process, two other things come to mind. One of which I notice is what I call a no pressure thinking. And I remind company owners, this is your company. Unless the bank or some creditor is forcing you out, you don't have to sell. And I notice that many people that they get kind of auction fever. They're all of a sudden, they just are presented with an idea to sell for the 1,000th time, but this time it clicks. And when it clicks, they adopt some sense of urgency that it has to be done soon, now, or this opportunity will get missed. And out of that, they start to get hurried, skipping steps, not reading their contracts well, not talking deeply with conversations with employees, family, and process. And they kind of get in a hurry. I've even seen it so bad that my friend sold more than a $20 million company, went through all the due diligence process, went to the signing table, and at the signing table, the guy sitting across the table was not the guy that he negotiated with. In the middle of the night, the buyer had backed out, called his friend, found a new buyer who took the exact same offer, put it on the table, and my friend signed it. Buyer pressure, seller pressure. He just got anxious. He didn't know the guy had effectively done all the due diligence between companies, but none of the due diligence between people. And he signed it anyway. And it's not going to surprise anyone that chaos ensued for the next 5 years. It was terrible. He ended up buying back a portion of the company because it was such a roaring mess. But he literally caused the mess himself, thinking, I got my dollars out of it, and that will be enough. And it's not. You can't sacrifice your principles and get in a hurry. In doing so, you will make a mess.
Good point, Eric. And actually, speaking of buyers and buyer types, I think, what you just mentioned, people get kind of wrapped up in the value, and you can get a good value and get a good fit. And you really want to look at both. And so, Raji, I'd like to, maybe you could talk a little bit about the different types of buyers out there and maybe kind of where you see yourself fit and kind of those different types and how you compare.
Yeah, we're a little unique because we are a private equity financial buyer, but we have multiple precision metal manufacturing companies within our portfolio. So we understand the space, we want to be in the space, and we're looking for other companies that are in the space. But typically there's a strategic angle where a much larger global company or a conglomerate is looking to make investments in a certain geographical area or for a customer base. That's typically what we're seeing, why an interest to move to a different location would be interesting to a company like that. And then from a financial perspective, there's going to be companies that are making their initial platform. And that's where I think you need to be very cognizant of what you're getting involved with, because if you're the initial platform company from a financial buyer, they're counting on you to be involved for a much longer period of time. So if you think you're exiting in 6 months, that's not realistic. They're going to need you for a lot longer. If you were selling to a strategic, you would probably be able to exit earlier or sooner than that. So there's a lot of different aspects that come into the different types of buyer. And I think that's where, we're saying that the buyer and seller need to know each other. Because that story just now about, I haven't heard that one yet. That's pretty scary that somebody would come to the table and sign without meeting somebody or spending time with them. So that's pretty important to me, Randy.
Yeah, I agree. The fit has to go both ways, right, to make a good transition for everyone.
If you're up for one more bounce back to the seller side, I like the way of just doing them back and forth. The other one that I run across is company culture. Now, culture is not new. You guys, if you're in the business, have heard all about culture, effectively how you take and treat your customers, your employees. But there's an aspect of culture that often gets skipped. And in my particular case of selling Holland Custom Metalworks, it was skipped. I didn't even realize that I had skipped it. And that's customer maturity. And what I mean by that is we were a relatively small company. And when we decided a decade before we sold that we were going to be a mature company. So although we weren't ISO certified, we acted like it internally. We had all of our process, weld certs, all of your material tracking, Kanban inventory management system. The list goes on. If you're in the metal space, you get all of this. And when the buyer came along, they were actually smaller than us. And I viewed this as a ginormous opportunity for them to leapfrog from a small company into a mature company. Instead of over the course of 5 years, they could do it in, I don't know, several months. And I just made the assumption that he was a mature company as well. That was an error. Turns out that we were a much more mature company from processes, internal accounting, just how we ran our customers. And we had customers that required mature processes to receive products. Without all of the paperwork that goes with it, they couldn't even accept a job. So when the point of sale came and we signed all the papers and they started to bring their teams up to speed, instead of viewing our processes as a maturity increase for his company, he viewed them through the lens of being a burden. That's too much trouble. I can't believe you invest all that time, effort, and energy to maintain this paper trail. This is ridiculous. I don't want to do that. We run mean and lean here type thought processes. And I knew from the moment that he said that he was doomed. He had bought our company partially for capabilities, but more for customer base and market share. And within 2 weeks, he called me back and threatened to sue me. He went through a long process of how I had sabotaged the company, sabotaged the clients, made all these phone calls to take and back them out so no one would use them again. And I said, well, what happened? He said, well, all of your customers left us. I said, well, did you ship all of the paperwork along with every job? Well, no, that's a waste of time. I said, well, that's why they left. And he did not realize that I did not realize that our company maturities were very, very, very different. And if I had to do it again, not just culturally how you treat your people, but I would sell to somebody that was as equally mature as our own company, or they were more mature than our own company, so that the selling company moves up in maturity, not down. It was a grave mistake that I had, and both companies went bankrupt within a year after they bought them.
Yeah, this is a step backwards versus, most owners when they sell, you want to see your company level up afterwards, right? You sell and you want to see it improve and level up versus going backwards or going bankrupt. So back to picking the right buyer. And, this is something that Eric and I have talked about over the years and why we've developed the process we have today of doing all the preparation, which we'll get into a little bit, because it makes a big difference in your after sale success. So talking about the exit process itself, so once you've identified who you think is the right buyer and you're working through the letter of intent and you're going through due diligence, there's a lot of different things that you have to think about and work through, and it is an intense timeline. They say the longer that a deal goes on in the closing process, the higher chance of it failing or falling apart. So everyone wants to keep things moving, but there's a lot of emotional fatigue. There's a lot of mental fatigue that happens. And so, one of the biggest issues is that, like I mentioned before, 75% of deals that are actually signed with a letter of intent and they think that they have a plan to close, they don't actually make it to the finish line. They never actually get to the closing table. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But Raji, I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because you've done something interesting where you've taken your letter of intent process and really made that more robust, I think, to help with this, the exit process itself. But I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about why you did that and kind of what you're trying to overcome with that.
Yeah, early on in my M&A career, when we started making acquisitions in the manufacturing space, I felt like less was more with the letter of intent. And over the years, I've realized that the more detailed the LOI is, the less complicated it's going to be when you get to the document stage when attorneys are engaged. So we try to spell out at least as much as we think we need to spell out in the LOI, talking about what kind of assets are going to be delivered, what kind of liabilities are going to be delivered or incurred, net working capital. We have things like how long is a seller going to stay on board? Is he required to stay on board with us? We cover in very basic terms reps and warranties, indemnifications. So these things seem like it could be overkill, but it actually does save a lot of time. And a seller, I'd say from a seller perspective, if you don't know everything that's going to come across in the process, can you imagine going 3 months of diligence and then kicking off legal documentation and finding out there's some terms in there that you had no idea existed? So knowing that ahead of time is a lot better than knowing it at the time of the documentation. You don't want to pay an attorney to learn that stuff. So at the end of the day, that's kind of changed. I'd say from kind of just some bullet points here to complexity of process and timeline. You can start years in advance to prepare for a sale, but once it starts and kicks off, people want to say, how long is it going to take? So I'll just give you kind of an average rate in my industry and way we look at things is typically a process is going to be between 6 to 8 months once you start. But they can go much longer than that. I've had deals that have gone on, well over a year. And usually the ones that go on longer are going to be because the seller is not prepared. They don't have the documentation in place. They're not ready for a sale. We had one recently that unfortunately, great company, environmental issues came up well after we had started with the legal documentation. So we've had a pause for 3 months on looking at a company that is a great company, but they didn't prepare themselves to understand what they had an issue with. And so, the mental and emotional fatigue for sure. I'd say patience there. You just got to walk in and understand it's going to be a long process. You have a day job that's running your business, and this is your other job, which is selling your business. They're both jobs, and it takes a lot of work. So being patient. And then, as far as having the right advisors, I have kind of a rule of thumb. Don't hire a divorce attorney and don't listen to your golf buddy. Two bad things you could be doing here, because everybody thinks they know how to sell a company and everybody's got an opinion. But you really have to find the right advisors that want to help you sell your business in the right way and are going to give you what the market comps are out there and what's right and wrong in a legal documentation. So choose your advisors and choose the people you listen to very wisely.
Mm-hmm. That's good advice, Raji. And Raji, I want to commend you for putting that amount of detail in the letter of intent. I have to fight with buyers all the time to get more detail in. They fight me on it because I think they worry that it's going to knock them out of the game when they're trying to buy a company. They're worried that it's going to, something the seller's not going to like is going to be in that letter of intent. And so therefore they're not going to get a chance. And they really feel like, as Eric said, once you kind of get the momentum going, that the seller's kind of stuck. Like the guy that went to the closing table and sold to a buyer didn't know. Well, because he's already been through months and months of work. And so he's so committed that he's going to override things that maybe you wouldn't override if you were upfront discussing it like right at the beginning. So you're taking a little bit of risk in that there might be some sellers that you don't move forward with you because you're being very transparent and open about, hey, these are terms that you're going to have to deal with at some point. But it also, I guess, protects you from having deals fall apart that would have fall apart anyway if they find out later that there will be a working capital target and there will be these different clauses. And so so there's some reward there too. But I'd say most of the buyers I know, they try and avoid that and try and use momentum to kind of get their way through to the closing. And a lot of them also do it with purchase price. I've seen a lot of buyers that will come in at a high value, knowing they don't want to close at that, but they're hoping that they wear the seller down through the process, and then if they want to renegotiate later, they can do that. And it's not a very fair way to do that to sellers, but unfortunately, I see that often. And so again, I appreciate your straightforwardness on that. And I don't know if you've lost out on deals because of that or not, but do you have a comment on that?
Yeah.
I think it's
well, we don't try to retrade deals. I think Eric mentioned a point earlier from a seller's perspective. You don't have to sell, and I love sellers that don't have to sell. But once we sign an LOI, people are starting to spend money and the time and resources. So if you're not ready to sell after you sign an LOI, I got a problem with that.
Yeah.
But it works both ways, not only from a seller standpoint, but from a buyer standpoint. A good buyer doesn't have to buy. If they find something during diligence that spooks, the crap out of them, they're not gonna close. So at the end of the day, I just think if you sign an LOI, both parties need to be ready to proceed and move forward. And if there's things that need to be disclosed, disclose them early and often. You won't imagine how many things that as long as you disclose it in the right way, you can work through it. It's the issues that are not disclosed and are discovered through diligence that, a seller knows up front that they got, for instance, the environmental issue, or they have a customer that is moving their business away, going offshore. That's a killer. If you know your numbers are going to be soft through a certain period of time, disclose it up front. But my point is a seller that wants to sell and a buyer that wants to buy, as long as you're being fair with one another, you can work through these issues. And it just takes some patience and it takes disclosure.
Yeah, I agree. Good comment.
And on my side, I would say the thing that really caused myself pain was assumptive language. We had a very weak LOI, kind of written from the perspective that was to our advantage, if you will, as you mentioned. But I made the assumption that it was weak because he already knew these things and there wasn't any point to bring them up. Of course they're in there. What else would you think? But as the deal got closed, it was very obvious that his ambition was well beyond his maturity. And I'm grateful in the end that it sold, but really sad of all the years of hard work that seemed to have just faded away and could have been something so much more. And I could have done that driving it from the sell side as well. I didn't realize it was happening at the time.
Yeah. So that brings us to including professional advisors in the process and the role of an M&A firm. So, there's a lot of transactions that are done without an M&A firm involved. As a matter of fact, the majority are. And the reason for that is, people are contacted or someone knows someone and makes an introduction. And that can work just fine, again, as long as you're prepared to sell. So the role of an M&A firm has traditionally been looked at, hey, their job is to find you a buyer. Well, in today's market, I'd have to say that's the easiest job. If I could get paid just to find a buyer, that would be the easiest job I could have in the world, because there's lots of buyers out there. There's lots of money right now. I was actually telling Raji before we started, I'm still shocked at how strong the M&A market is, how many buyers that we have coming through the doors looking for metal fabrication businesses and different manufacturing companies. The valuations are holding up even with interest rates rising. And so to find a buyer is the easy part. It's really finding the right buyer, but to know if it's the right buyer, you have to do your preparation work. You have to understand, what are the challenges that you might have. As Raji said, being upfront and transparent in the beginning really, really helps. And it also helps you identify the right buyer. If you have a weak management team and you try and say that you have a management team, but they're really not one, that'll come out eventually. It's so, really understanding your strengths and weaknesses up front and being transparent about that. And if you don't have a strong management team, then you might have to rethink the buyer that you're going to be selling to. It might have to be a strategic that already has a management team in place and doesn't need that, or an individual that's going to come in and run the company. But that's just one example. But really what we do at NuVescor is spend, the first several months with our client. And it goes anywhere from a few months of time to prepare to we have times we spend years. And really it comes down to, okay, what are you trying to accomplish as a seller? What are your goals? Where's your strengths and weaknesses as a company? Where is that at? And then what type of buyer do you want to sell to? And those all have to align. So if you have a certain buyer in mind, you want to sell maybe to a strategic or a private equity, you want to be a platform company, whatever those goals are, you have to make sure your company's actually aligned with that. So we'll help identify those gaps and the different options you have. And so some people will say, well, I thought I wanted to sell to my management team. And then they come in and we go through the preparation process and find out, well, your management team really can't afford it and they're not really set up to run it. There's some issues there, or maybe it's a great fit and we can help get the financing for that. So we're really trying to to put all the pieces of the puzzle together to find the right match. And that's what we spend most of our time on now. So finding the buyer is again, the easy part. It's the part that's the smallest part of our process. It takes about 30 days to 45 days to find the buyer and, and start the process of going into the closing, but months of preparation. And then the actual closing process can take months as well. But the window from when you go to market to when you get under a letter of intent, which is when you've actually identified the buyer, is 30 to 45 days. So out of the whole 6 months to a year process, the actual finding the buyer part is the shortest piece of the process, shortest part of the process. But yet a lot of owners think that's what the value of an M&A firm brings. So when you're looking at M&A firms, you want to make sure that's not the only thing they're bringing to the table. If you're looking for that, there are what's called a business broker model, and that's really where you have, their job is to find a buyer and kind of put you together. You're really looking more for either boutique M&A firm or an investment banking model where you have a team of experts, and so they have different disciplines and market research and financial analysis and kind of operations, looking at your business from different perspectives and putting together the information that's needed for buyers, but also helping you understand what's a reasonable expectation to have if you go to market as far as the type of buyers you're going to get and the valuation you can expect, and really understanding that before you move forward. And so that's the firm that you want to work with, is someone that can do all of that, not just find the buyer. So I want to talk a little bit about the valuation process itself, and working through the negotiations. And there's a lot of different ways to value a company. And so, this is always a tough question. I get it all the time is, what is my business worth? And then, so of course, the classic answer, well, it depends, because it really does depend on a lot of factors. And Raji touched on some of them when he was talking about what buyers look for. But what I can say is, usually it's a multiple of cash flow. And the reason for that is the buyers are looking for return on their investment. And so if they're going to pay a certain amount of money for a business, they'd like to see that return in a period of time. So they're looking for, multiples. You'll hear multiple ranges from, lowest 3 times your EBITDA, which is your earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, all the way up to 6 to 7 times EBITDA. So it could be a big range. It depends a lot on your size. Smaller companies are not as attractive and usually don't have the infrastructure in place, so their valuations are lower than larger companies that do have management teams, great process, they're more mature, more stable customer base. They can get a higher multiple. So that's why there's such a big range. But I guess, Raj, if you don't mind talking a little bit about what you kind of how you look at valuation. I know structure has a lot to do with it too. So it's not just the number, it's how it's structured too, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great point. Structure depends if a seller wants to sell and get 100% cash for his business and wants to leave, and I kind of smile and laugh at this, wants to leave within 30 days post closing. That's one price. If a seller understands that they need to be around for a couple of years or excited about the future and wants to roll some equity and actually be part of kind of the second wave post closing, that's really what gets financial buyers like myself excited. But we've seen it both ways. But value for a seller, the market's going to dictate a lot of the value, the timing. But it's not just the industry timing; it's the timing in the business. For instance, if you've just recently got a contract or not, won an award from a new customer, and that customer expects to give you X, Y, or Z business over a period of years, that's obviously a great time to go to market if you're ready to sell. But also, I think the leadership transition for a seller, whether you want to be around for a couple of years or a couple of months, you need to make sure you have an accurate leadership transition in place, and you can't BS your way through that. Like Randy said, I've seen it many, many, many times where somebody says, I got the perfect guy who's going to take over the business for me. And you find out that great person, he can run the machine very well, but can he run the company? Can he be a president? Can he be a CEO of the company? And nine out of 10 times it's a no. And so at the end of the day, I think finding the right leadership transition in place, or being willing to stay around long enough for that leadership transition, is very, very critical to a buyer like myself.
That's a good point. Yeah, there's that. Yeah, so there's intangible values there, like, yeah, the length of time the owner's going to stay with the company, what's the team look like, um, that affect the multiple. And it's really, so you really can't give a generic answer on what's a business worth until you dig into all those intangibles and really understand the business. So one of the things that frustrates me is, we are certified to do valuations. So we're a certified valuation analyst. We have 2 on staff. So we can do a certified valuation all day long. It's really hard just to take the numbers and crank out a value that's actually realistic in the marketplace. And so, what happens is people will go and get a certified valuation and they say, well, someone did a valuation on my company and they think that is the value. But, without really digging into all these intangible aspects of it and spending the time getting to know the company, you really can't do it just on the numbers. And so Raj, I don't know if you had any experience with that, but that's one of the things that I struggle with is helping educate sellers on what does drive value in their company. And it's not just a straight multiple of EBITDA.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Randy. And you're in the business to do valuation, but more importantly, sell businesses and advise your clients. But the evaluations that are in the market are kind of tough to follow. Every deal is going to be different. I have a lot of people throwing public comps in my face, and it's like that. It's meaningless for a small middle market company in the middle of Michigan. So, at the end of the day, it really depends on what you can bring, value prop. Again, there's 3 or 4 different things we look at. I mean, although financials, are important, that, having making sure you put your ducks in a row on your financials before you go to market is great, because it just shows that you understand that's important. Be the leadership transition, and then the differentiators. And if you can check the box in all 3 of those, you're going to get, the middle market to upper middle range of valuation. And if you go in and think those things aren't important, you're not going to get the valuation that you think you deserve.
Yeah, good point.
I'd like to throw in there the same way you started this portion on the value. What's the value of the company? And the answer is, it depends. On the seller side, keep in mind, as an owner, it depends. You can negotiate just about every aspect of a job, of the sale, and you got to keep in mind, it depends. Some owners get so rigid that has to be this way, that they throw the baby out with the bathwater, not realizing they could still achieve the same goal, negotiate it 2 different ways, slightly to the left, move the other factor slightly to the right, get the same answer, and the negotiation moves on, but they get hung up on something. And use the factor of it depends to your advantage. It's the negotiation tool. It's keep that in mind. The system is flexible.
Yeah, I really agree with that. That actually works both ways with the buyer and seller, but I think that's super important. A lot of times we see a seller that, I want 100% for my business. I'm leaving within 30 days post closing, and I just kind of chuckled, because they don't realize that if they would just say, hey, how long do you need me?
Right.
And, hey, I know what's important for this business, that I don't leave, 30 days. I will stay as long as we are working towards finding my replacement. And as long as you're showing me that you're working with me in good faith towards that goal, I'll stay as long as it takes to get that accomplished. And I said this to Randy all the time. I think buyers and sellers don't realize how aligned they really actually are. Because most sellers, anybody who's sitting on this call today, you work very, very hard to grow your business. And I don't think anyone on this call would want to sell it and let it deteriorate, within the first 6 months. So, both the buyer stepping in, the customers are super important to both, right? A lot of times a seller will say, I'm not letting you know my customers. I'm not disclosing my customer names. I'm not letting you talk to them. And I just kind of wonder that, it's important for both of us to be on the same page regarding the importance of customers and employees for that reason. And one more thing I'd say that actually adds a lot of value to us in our process. I know everybody doesn't want to get their entire company involved. Hey, I'm selling my business tomorrow, but having a couple of key managers involved with the process really does help. If you have your accountant involved in the process, or your general manager, or your salesperson that you can trust, that you can pull into the process at the right time, it just shows that you have a team environment, that you're not just looking at the best interest of yourself, but you're actually looking at the best interest of your company.
And I'll take that one more level. I advise people that your business, I surprise myself Owners are convinced their business isn't for sale until they decide to. But the moment you created your business, it was for sale. And the sale is inevitable, whether it's generational or ESOP or whatever it is, the sale of it is inevitable. And if you keep a culture of it's for sale, there isn't any reason to take it, hold it back from the team. They already know the company's for sale. It's been for sale since the very first day. The whole point of the company was to generate income for all of its team members and to be sold someday. That's the whole goal. And instead of trying to pretend that that's not the goal, the more that you bring your team into it from even having a culture of adaptability, really, really, really is helpful in the process.
Yeah, we're getting to the end of our time. So anyone that has questions, please submit them. But I do want to go over any kind of last lessons learned here for the next couple minutes, and then we'll jump into Q&A. But as you talk about that, Eric, one thing I've seen that's worked really well is I've had people that will take some of their key team members, and years before they sell, they'll say, look, I'm going to be selling someday, and I want you to be part of that process. And they end up giving them, stay bonuses to stay, during the transition, after the transition. And the buyers really appreciate that too, because it's kind of like they know what's going on. They can talk to these management members before they buy. They can get comfortable with them, and then they know there's actually a document in place that's going to reward them down the road for staying with the buyer and making sure that works out. So that's been something I've seen that's been a real positive. But I'd love to hear either one of you, any things that you've seen that either buyers or sellers have done to kind of help make the actual transition from seller to buyer go smoother. So that's one example, is these these contracts with management team. But anything that you guys could talk about as far as helping to make it a more positive transition?
One of the things that we did as a family business is that the family told the company that it was for sale in a company meeting, and there was no buyer. They just wanted to start to let the company know this company's for sale. Be reminded of that. And over the course of the 2 years before a buyer actually showed up on the scene, the company was not only did the buyer talk to lead managers, the buyer walked the shop floor, because the company was already geared up 2 years in advance that the company was for sale. When they said, well, who's going to buy it? They said, nobody. We're just letting you know it's for sale. And they started that process. It was very, very helpful.
Yeah, I would say that's great. That's one of the things that I think is really important, and that's why I mentioned key management, is that we typically are going to create a stock option pool for key management. So that's why we want to know who they are prior to the closing. But if you buy them in on the concept that you are not trying to change the culture, you're trying to upgrade systems, you're maybe trying to add new customers, but you're not trying to change the culture, you'll find out that 99% of them buy into that, because we actually make investments in a lot of rural communities, and our motto is we don't want to screw up the culture. We're not relocating, and we're not bringing laying off people. We want to grow the company. And so if they believe in that and you honor that, they're going to buy into it pretty quickly post closing.
Yeah, the opposite's true. A lot of times buyers may say that and they don't honor it, and it's a nightmare when they don't honor it. Eric, you've got examples of that you've heard, experienced and heard. So yeah, it's
even after the careful selection of culture, buyer, and everything, the shift that the founded company was 60 years old under the same family management, the company would make 30 years, 35-year, 40-year decisions in advance, seeing that this was a good move. And the company that purchased it is quarterly focused. And so they started making quarterly decisions. And that culture shift alone was shockingly unpleasant.
Yeah. So it depends on, so you got to find out, how the businesses operate differently. If it's more of an issue with strategic buyers buying you, because they have a certain way of operating, right? So when Raji's making an investment, he really wants to protect that investment and let that company run as it has been running as far as the culture, and he can do that. But when these larger strategic buyers buy, a lot of times they have to impose the way they operate on the business they're buying, and that's where it makes it hard to maintain that culture. So they can say we're going to maintain it, but it can become difficult in this under that situation. Well, good. Actually, I think I want to make sure we get to some questions here. So we'll start the Q&A. And I think Tyson, you were going to tee us up with some questions that came in.
Yeah, we had a couple come in here. I think this first one is kind of all one. It says, how can you/we help the seller prepare for the two big issues which get them in trouble? And those two issues are, one, what is your what's next? And two, how to reduce the tax or prepare them for dealing with the tax.
So the two big issues which get them in trouble. So yeah, what's next? And then the tax situation. So and Raji, I know we've talked before on there's a lot of ways to structure things for at least the tax side. So maybe you can share a little bit about that, and then we can ask Eric to share about thinking how do you think about what's next for yourself. I think you're on mute right now, Raji.
I was saying on the tax side, I would say the best advice I can say is good luck on that one. But no, there's a lot of things you can do in preparing for a sale of a business. Unfortunately, the best way to prepare for the sale of the business is when you set up your business, which a lot of business owners don't do correctly from the very beginning. So they're playing catch up. But all I can tell you is that it's probably too complicated to get on with the last few minutes on this seminar, this webinar, but there's a lot of things happening for small businesses that can be tax advantageous. So whether it's a C Corp or we're seeing a lot of things out there with set up a C Corp. That's the big mistake a lot of owners made back in the day. And actually there's some big incentives for C Corps these days that we're seeing out there. But from the standpoint, Randy, of the tax, I'd leave that to the tax advisors, and every owner should be speaking to their tax advisor before they actually start the process of taking it to market.
Yeah, that's the key. Eric, anything to add on either the tax side or maybe you can talk about specifically the what's next I know you coach different people through different life stages, and obviously selling a company is a huge life change. Any thoughts
So on the tax side, I would keep in mind donor advised funds. If you're of that thought process to take and donate part of your company, can be a ginormous tax advantage and a real tool. Ask your advisor about it. And the other one, the real question that's tough is what's next. And I suppose that depends on your worldview. If you're of the worldview that this money is all mine, I'm going to keep it, I'm going to sit on the beach, do nothing with it and rot. I find that many people, when they lose their purpose, they do exactly that. They rot. And I would highly encourage you to engage in new purpose even before the sale starts. Practice it, get involved, get your passion for what it is you view next started before you sell. If you start with just, I don't know, getting involved with the local nonprofit in your area, and you find that it takes a couple of 2 years to get involved and highly involved. Get that process started. You can do it now. It doesn't have to be a shock. Going back to the design, the sale, start designing now what it is you're going to do next. If your worldview is where I'm coming from, which is a Christian worldview, then I'd get a little book called God Guides and I'd read it and do what it says and just listen. Ask God what it is that he would ask you to do, and then do that.
And thanks for submitting questions. Continue to do that. You hit the Q&A button on Zoom. You can type your question in there. Tyson, any other questions come in?
This next one's kind of geared towards Eric, but what kind of tips do you have when evaluating a buyer? In your experience, what should I be looking out for?
What I would do now is I'd go tour their shop floor. It'd be the first thing that I would do. long before they walked in my shop, I would go view theirs. They're viewed as a threat when they come into the shop for various reasons, but I'm not viewed as a threat when I go to theirs. I'm viewed as a potential client or something else. I'd go view their shop floor. I can walk around someone else's shop floor and in 15 minutes, watch their paper, their process, their flow. I can have a really great idea on where they are maturity-wise, operational-wise, in an hour's worth of a walkthrough through a company to see if that's a good fit. And I don't have to talk to anybody. I wish I would have done that in our situation. They came obviously and walked through our plant many times, but I never bothered to go through theirs. I just figured that they knew what they were doing. That was a bad assumption.
I'll add one more on top of that. You can also interview. In my situation, we have 3 or 4 investments in the metal fab space.
Yep.
I would be more than willing to have anybody that I'm going to bat with talk to any of those sellers to find out what the references are on a buyer. And it just like Eric said, it could work both ways. And you know, you're not going to be able to hide that feedback.
Great point. That's good. Thank you.
Well, I got a quick question, Randy, for the group here. I really need to know who's going to win this March Madness thing. So if they can send me an email on that, I'd appreciate it.
There you go.
That's funny. This one's kind of geared towards Raji. It's not a March Madness one, so sorry to burst your bubble there. But what are some culture and management aspects you look for when evaluate companies to buy? Or when evaluating companies to buy, sorry.
Yeah, the culture side of it's actually as simple as it gets. It's like walking into a kindergarten room. It's like you can walk into a company and really tell if people are happy. You know, I walk away from businesses that are doom and gloom. You can tell a lot by a company, you know, a lot of things that they have going on at their company, whether it's, you know, as simple as a quarterly, you know, picnic or you're doing something, you know, with their team. We love seeing that kind of thing because you can tell that the employees believe in the business. And from the other aspect you were asking for was what?
Yeah, it just said culture and management. So
yeah, well, management. I think you want to make sure you have a well-organized management team. You know, we said it before. Just disclosing if you have a hole in your management team. For instance, if you lost your controller in the last 3 months and you're trying to find that person, you got a temporary accountant on board. Disclose that. We know it's a hole. We're going to understand we need to replace that. If you're everybody on this call right now understands that, you know, the human aspect of running your business is the most difficult. So there's always going to be holes in your management teams. Disclosing that before you get to the closing is super important. So you're both working together to fill that, you know, post-closing.
Yeah. Good.
thanks for that. Here's another one kind of geared towards the group here. What is the average EBITDA multiple that you see for sheet metal fab shops with a machine shop, powder coating, and electrical assembly capabilities?
Mm. Who wants to take a pass at that one?
Yeah.
I'm going to go with it depends.
Yeah.
That's literally like asking what's the value of my house in Detroit, Michigan. I don't know. I haven't even seen your house. I don't know what neighborhood it is in, what the school system is. I don't know anything about your house and don't know how big it is. That's a question that what Randy could dig into and answer that question with a little bit of research, but to ask it blindly, man, there's probably 1,000 variables that go into that answer. And
Yeah,
it depends.
I kind of gave the range when I was talking about value. I mean, like, you know, 3 to 7. I know that's a huge range, but I mean, it's you know, it like I said, it depends on your size. If you're over $1 million in EBITDA, or you're under $1 million, you're over $5 million in EBITDA, it's, you know, those are huge jumps in value right there. That can go from that low 3 to the higher in the 7. You know, do you have your management team in place? You know, so that's why, yeah, it is such a big range. And Raj, anything to add to that?
Yeah, you could probably throw a dart in the middle of that range. And then how I look at it is that you start digging yourself for things that you know are going to be, trouble. A customer concentration, probably take down one turn. So if you throw the dart and it's at 5, you're probably down to a 4. But if you don't have a customer concentration, you might go up a half a turn. If you have audited financials, which a lot of companies do not have at a smaller middle market company, that's something that can really add a lot of value, believe it or not, when you go to the market. So I think you throw your dart in the middle and you think about the things that are really valuable and think about the things that you really need to work on. And you can probably have a pretty good idea of plus or minus where you're going to go. But I really think at the end of the day, like Eric said, it really depends. Bad answer. But that's where you need to sit down with somebody like Randy, and he's going to help you evaluate what that range is.
Yeah, that's great. So I see one more. It's kind of on Randy's end. This one says, what about the transaction process do you see surprises people the most?
Yeah, so an area of dispute that comes up a lot, and I think owners get surprised by this, is how working capital is handled. And I'm still surprised at how much of a hot button topic it becomes, because this can be up to 10% of the purchase price sometimes, and as far as overall value. But there's a lot of owners who they think they're gonna keep their receivables, like, hey, these are mine, I made these. It's like they look at it as their cash. And so it's like, no, the buyer's gonna get a level of working capital with the business. And a lot of owners think that the working capital is something they created and they're going to keep, and so it becomes this big disagreement. Now, when you put it in the LOI up front, that helps make sure we're on the same page with it. But a lot of, as I mentioned before, a lot of buyers try and leave details out into the end. And so one of the things that happens that comes up later says, oh, well, your business has to have at least this amount of working capital with it. So AR, inventory, minus your payables, a certain amount, a certain level. And if it's less than that, we're going to deduct from the purchase price. And if it's more than that, we're going to add to. And so this seems to be a big surprise to owners, and it's something that maybe they're not familiar with as far as in the valuation process. But you got to open it up to anyone else too, Raji. Anything, if you agree with that, or if you want other things too that surprise people.
Yeah, I mean, the net working capital, it's difficult for a small business owner to understand quite what that is. But the way I describe it is, as a buyer, I just want to see you run your business in normal course. I don't want you doing anything differently. I don't want you changing the way you collect your money, calling Bob and saying, can you pay me earlier? At the end of the day, it is what it is. And you're just trying to set a peg that says this is what you're going to deliver. And like Randy said, it gets trued up afterwards. And unfortunately, we see a lot of people, Randy, even smaller and bigger deals that don't get that. And that's another reason why, like in the LOI, you want to kind of work through that. And what we try to do is give a number in the LOI and show an example as an exhibit A or B or C that is attached to the LOI, which describes how that's going to be calculated. And it kind of checks that box before you get into it in the legal documentation.
That's great.
Awesome.
Well, good. Well, I anything else, Tyson? I think we're past time too, so I don't want to hold people up here.
Yeah, I think we're okay, but I appreciate all the questions, everyone, and let Randy close out here.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to the panelists for participating. If you do have questions for any of the panelists, you can always email me. My email address is here on the screen. Feel free to give me a call. You can look us up online. And if you just have some questions, no problem. Feel free to reach out and ask. Be happy to answer anything I can. We again, our goal is to make sure that you have the education that you need, the knowledge that you need to have a good transaction. Whether we help you with it or not, we'll be happy to kind of at least point in the right direction. And I'm sure the panelists would be as well. That's why they agreed to participate on this call. And so, yeah, feel free to reach out. And again, with that, I just want to thank you for participating.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.